ladies and gents, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program. So, last time I did a video on KSP, I left you guys on a bit of a cliffhanger as to whether or not this Lunar base launch was actually going to work. And I'm sure you've noticed the name of the video title before you clicked on it. Now, I don't want to be accused as being clickbaity here, and I don't want to disappoint anyone who is expecting something horrible to happen and it doesn't, so I'm going to actually be upfront about this one now. Disaster does strike in this video, but it's not with this launch. This launch goes... well, you'll see. I couldn't have actually calculated what I would need to pull this off any better. But you'll see this when the landing completes. I know I just destroyed a huge chunk of the suspense with these opening lines, but yeah, disaster strikes elsewhere in this video into something, well, it's a little bit more problematic for the series. So, we've started off the launch. The liquid fuel boosters are burning away, getting us up to speed. They are also feeding fuel into the central tank. Now, why the primary engine, you can see, carries more fuel than anything else, and it does look like it's going down. Make no mistakes, that top fuel tank, because all the tanks are linked together, is reading the total fuel that's available to the rocket at this time. That central tank is completely full at all times. It never goes down. And once I jettison the external liquid boosters, you'll see it goes back to full fuel. Now, the launch speed, I should have guessed, was going to be a little bit slower. This is an exceptionally heavy rocket, heavier than anything else that I've launched before. The acceleration on it was... well, it was slow. There's no other way to put it. This was a very slow to accelerate rocket, and probably the slowest launch that I've done in the KSP series, and I've done in KSP in some time. Now, if you remember from the last video when I showed the actual construction of this rocket, I fitted the heat shield as I was worried about possible plasma effects accelerating too quickly into the atmosphere. I really didn't need to worry about a heat shield. That was never going to be an issue. I could have got away with just an aerodynamic nose cone to protect the solar panels that sit directly underneath it, but it doesn't matter. So, as we pass 14 kilometers, the liquid fuel boosters run out of juice, and at that point I immediately detach them. One of them slightly clips the rocket as it goes through, but does no damage. Rocket continues on its burn with no problems at all, passing 500 meters a second and continuing to accelerate. Almost at 20 kilometers up, and there we go, there's 20 kilometers, continuing through. Everything is running seamlessly. This was, well, I think this was without a doubt probably the smoothest launch of a new design that I've had in KSP in a long time. I generally do have some teething issues. And what I mean by that is I generally have rocket designs when I'm doing a first design that they'll get the job done, but they will never do it optimally. I'm never happy with the way a first series rocket performs its mission, so I usually make a lot of adjustments in subsequent launches. This one, I don't think I would have changed anything. Not that I would probably ever launch this rocket again. This rocket was built solely to put a base on the Mun that fit the mission parameters in order for me to be able to get the paycheck that I wanted out of the mission contractor. Now, mission command for this particular rocket is, of course, Jebediah Kerman, and Bob's along for the ride, so this is also one of the first multi-crew rockets that I've launched in the series. Now, the requirements for the Mun base in order to complete the mission was it had to have life support and space for 6 Kerbals, but it didn't actually require that you sent 6 Kerbals up, just that the base itself had the space for them. Now, at this point, Apoapsis has passed out beyond 80 kilometers. We are now definitely going into space, so I'm just getting ready to shut down the engines. At which point, before I complete my orbital burn, I'm actually going to tilt the rocket 90 degrees off my intended direction of travel and jettison the heat shield off the nose of the rocket. This means the heat shield will just drift and fall back into the atmosphere and burn up and disappear. No space garbage will be left, and more importantly, there'll be nothing floating directly in front of the rocket for me to hit when I begin my acceleration to complete my orbital burn. So just quickly jumping into the maneuver planner to plan my orbital burn. I don't really need to do this in order to complete the circularization. It is more just to give me a marker so I can align the ship up easily after dropping off the heat shield. So with the maneuver planned and the marker visual, begin rotating the ship through. Now, this is still an incredibly heavy ship. It's still got half a load of fuel on board. It's got all the space for the 6 Kerbals. Its rotation time is incredibly slow, so I need to start this straight away so I have time to get back on the burn point prior to actually needing to perform my circularization burn. Dropping off the heat shield is pretty simple. It's just a matter of turning it about 25 to 30 degrees off center and then right-clicking on the docking port once I get the camera zoomed out enough so I can see what I'm doing, and hitting the jettison button. And that will just detach the heat shield, problem solved. Now, of course, the reason why I used a docking port and not a decoupler is because one of the requirements of the base was to have a docking port available. So 2 birds, 1 stone. With the shield detached, realign, ready for the burn, and then it's just a matter of waiting to fire the engines. So I'm going to pass through most of this relatively quickly. Why this is a significantly larger ship than my previous rockets, and much heavier. The actual maneuvers and planning for this particular mission are not really any different to the previous rocket launches that you've seen where I go to the Mun. Obviously the burn times are a lot longer because this is a much larger and heavier ship, so it takes a bit longer to get this thing up to speed. The burn time to orbit here took about 60 seconds as opposed to the previous launches, which were between 30 to 45. The only real difference in the maneuvers on this one is that this rocket should have enough fuel to complete the burn to transfer to the Mun, where previous launches only had enough fuel in the ascent stage to complete half the burn, and then I had to detach the engine and go through to the primary engine for the command module in order to complete the transfer burn. So, only 4 seconds left on this burn, and then we sit in orbit and wait till the Mun comes over the horizon, as we have with every other launch. Now when we launched, the Mun was to our rear, so it did take almost a full orbit before we got ourselves into position where the Mun was in the right spot. Once again, we begin the burn. The actual transfer burn itself is not going to take a particularly huge amount of time. As always, takes a little bit to get the rocket going. The further out we manage to put our apoapsis, however, the faster it will accelerate. And as I said just a moment ago, unlike the previous launches, this one, the ascent stage, had enough fuel remaining to be able to complete the intercept without having to jettison a tank. So there we go, intercept completed. And now we're in the Mun's sphere of influence, so at this point we can get ready to start our deceleration burns to put ourselves into a lunar orbit. Now, why we did have enough to complete the transfer burn on the ascent stage, it was only just. There was only about 6 units of Delta V, and I actually didn't realise this at the time I was playing. I was lining up ready for the deceleration burn, got myself into position, and that was the point that I realised that this tank, well, I actually started the burn. It wasn't until the burn just commenced for a split second, and I'm about to start that, and then immediately shut down, that the tank was on vapors. So we're aligned and push the throttles up, and that little fart you heard just then was all the tank had left in it. So since we're retrograde for a deceleration burn, we just jettison the tank, activate the base's primary engine, and we can just use it from this point on. Now the ascent stage isn't actually going to stay in orbit. Now it's detached, it's going to continue out, it's going to accelerate as it goes past the back of the Mun, and from that point on it's actually going to go interplanetary. I have no idea where it's going to wind up, but it's not going to be here. So at this point, throttles on the main engine to around 50% or just under. We don't need a huge amount, I just want to slow this down enough to drop my periapsis as close to the planet as I possibly can, at which point I'm going to complete the burn at the periapsis itself. A few moments of time acceleration later and we are at the periapsis. Quickly hit the autopilot functions, or the Jebediah pilot functions, in order to make sure we're lined up retrograde for the next section of the burn. Throttle up. Doesn't need a huge amount of power. We're probably only playing with around 20% at maximum, and there we go, we have an orbit. At this point I've just got to gently control the burn to bring the orbit down to low altitude. So I'm in a parking orbit ready to begin my descent. Now I'm not going to descend immediately from this position, and this is because at the moment we're in a position where the side of the Mun that is facing Kerbal, the side I want to actually land on, is currently not facing the sun, and this space has no lights. I don't want to do a blind landing, so I'm just going to let myself sit in orbit for a couple of orbits until the Mun moves around the far side of Kerbal and I've actually got the sun on the right side. Of course, with the time acceleration functionality, this doesn't take too long. Once I'm in position, begin my burn down. Now, originally I was going to land on the far side of the crater. I actually scouted out a potential landing zone, but I changed my mind midway through this mission. I decided that I wanted to put this thing down smack bang in the center of this crater, mainly because, well, I hadn't landed there yet. The landing zone I selected was a much smoother place to land. It was very flat, there was nothing around, but it was on the Minmus Flats, and I've already pulled the science out of that biome. If I'm going to go somewhere, I might as well land somewhere where I haven't been. Now I had to use the maneuver nodes to make a very small adjustment to my descent. I wanted to bring this thing down smack bang in the middle of the crater. Now you'll see my trajectory is actually slightly off the center of the crater, and this is deliberate. One, because the Mun is actually rotating as I'm descending on it, and two, because I'm planning on killing all of my horizontal movement at about 2 kilometers before the landing point. That will put me at about center of the crater if I've timed everything right. And so we begin our descent. Now I'm watching the gauge on the right hand side for my actual altitude above terrain while I'm using time acceleration, so I can time in exactly when I want to start backing that off without overshooting. As you can see, I've become pretty comfortable with landing on the Mun, it's not too much of an issue. Now, while we're completing the rest of this descent, what my original plan for was with this base, with the 2 Kerbals on board, is once this mission completed, I had 2 missions planned next. The first was going to be an unmanned mission to this base that was going to have a ship that had room for 1 Kerbal to come back, but it was also going to carry the first rover. The idea was the base would land, Jebediah would come home, and I was going to leave Bob up there with the rover to do all the sciencey stuff and wander around the planet. He would have the life support of all the 6 Kerbal modules to himself, which means he'd be able to stay up there for about 2 months before he ran out. Now the second launch was going to utilise this base as an antenna. The second launch was going to be automated as well. However, I was going to launch a probe to Duna. Now I hadn't actually got around to setting up my remote tech satellite network yet, which makes automated launches or remote launches problematic, as I need direct line of sight at all times. Thankfully, this base with its long range antennas, if I waited till the Mun was in the correct position above Kerbin, could work as that satellite network for long enough for me to be able to get that probe into orbit and then get it on its way without actually having to have the satellite network established yet. So that was the second reason for the construction of this base, besides completing the mission objectives, of course. So anyways, back to the descent. Landing gear is deployed. We've killed almost all of our horizontal velocity. We're just letting the lander gently tip itself over into the vertical, and then we're just going to let it descend. Now at this point you'll notice I'm extremely low on fuel. I'm down to probably the bottom fifth of my tank. Of course that's not a problem in the slightest, as this base was never going to be coming back to Kerbin. This was going to be a permanent fixture of the Mun for the rest of my career. Now I did start the deceleration burn slightly too early. We're at 3.7 kilometers. I was actually hoping to do it at about 2 kilometers. But I was a little worried I was going to overshoot the center of the crater. And I know the center of the crater is clear to land on, but once you get out of the center a little bit, there are other impact craters within the crater itself, forming ridge lines and so on. And this is a very top-heavy rocket. I didn't want to land on one of those. It would just tip over. 2.2 kilometers and still rotating through to the vertical. We still do have some side horizontal speed, but that will go away as the rocket straightens itself out for descent. Descending at 80 meters a second, we're at 1.5 kilometers and falling. And we're now under 1 kilometer, so we fire up the engines and begin decelerating. Down to 50 meters a second. Drop it down to 40, down to 200 meters, still falling fast. 170 meters and we're down to 5 meters per second. I can see the shadow, so we're lined up, just letting the rocket gently drift its way down now. Down to the last slivers of fuel in the tank. Just gently pulsing the engine. As I said, this is a heavy rocket, it's very top heavy. It looks like there is a slight slope on the terrain too, just judging from the shadow and the texture underneath the rocket, so just control it down as much as I can. There's almost no fuel left in the tank at all now. Just gently holding, and touchdown. The base settles. So how close did I manage the resources for this particular mission? Well, on touchdown there were 3 units of fuel left in the tank. That's barely enough fuel to refire these engines in order to destabilize this base enough for it to fall over. So all that was left to do at this point was deploy the antennas and get ready to drop the Kerbals out and have a look around. So, all things considered, this was a well done mission. I'm pretty happy with the outcome. I got the base, I completed the mission objectives, and I now have my repeater station for my unmanned missions for future launches. So, where's the disaster? So, not long after completing this mission, I did a hardware upgrade on my computer. I changed over from a 750 titanium over to a GTX 980. I'm not sure if that had anything to do with it, but previous to that changeover, my client for this Kerbal Space program worked perfectly, without a problem. After I did that change, however, this happens every time I try and load it. My normal version of KSP that's up to date, that is unmodded, is perfectly fine, but both this and the backup for the career mode are dead. Now, I've tried updating my clean version of the client, which is sitting under Steam, to all the current versions of the mods that I use and transferring my saves over, but it appears the save games have corrupted as well. So the client no longer works, and the save games all appear to be dead. As a result, my Kerbal Space Program career is now unrecoverable, and there's nothing that I can really do about it. Now, that doesn't mean my Kerbal Space Program series on my channel is dead. Surprisingly, I actually haven't put a huge amount of hours into KSP in order to get up to this point. I'm probably looking at maybe 12 hours total for all the videos that are on channel at the moment. It's the actual time that I have spent playing KSP, so I can recover myself about to where I am in a day. However, I am likely going to use different designs to get there. And this, of course, will be very noticeable. But it does also allow me an opportunity. There have been a few new mods released that I'm actually reasonably interested in, that only work on newer versions of the client. So this also gives me the opportunity to update and change a few mods and reconsider a few things in the way I was doing. What I'm thinking about doing at this point is I'm actually going to stop this section of the series here and rebrand them all as Season 1. And I'm going to start a new Season 2 Kerbal Space Program. And I'm going to use the events of these videos as a background story for the second series. So I will start off the second series with Bob and Jebediah stranded on the Mun. I'm going to have to create some reason that contact was lost and that all my ships went down. I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do with that yet. I'm going to have to take a little bit of time to think about it. This is why it's taken me so long to get this next Kerbal Space Program video out. I've literally been screwing around with my client for 3 weeks trying to get it to work so I can continue the series. And I finally come to the conclusion that there was no way to recover, so I'm going to have to get a little creative. I'm not sure how long it will take me to get the next KSP video up. I've got to completely build new mod lists. I have to build and stabilize an entirely new client, make sure it's all good. I'm probably going to look at some visual mods this time. I'm thinking Scatterer and a few other things to make it look very pretty on the channel. I've wanted to run Scatterer for a while, but it was very unstable on 1.02, which was the version that I'm using. And I may possibly hold off and instead of use 1.04, which is the current version of the client, I believe 1.05 is going to be released very soon. And I have heard a rumor, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it may include the update to the Unity 5 engine, which I would most certainly like to run. So, ladies and gents, now you know why it's been 3 weeks since the last episode, what's been taking me so long to actually finally complete this mission, and, well, what I'm planning on doing in order to correct the issue and get KSP up and running again on the channel. I do want to get this series out a lot more often, because I absolutely love playing KSP. It is easily one of my favourite games to jump on at the moment. And I really love that there's quite a few of you out there who really enjoy me playing it. So, until next time, ladies and gents, click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more. Fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.